Recently I got hit that question. It's the what is a woman question, but in reverse. So what is a man? And the simple answer is adult human male. But it really got me thinking. What is masculine? What makes a man a man? What would you consider to be masculine traits? I I started thinking about this one major story that's kind of been something that I've reflected on so many times in my life. And frankly, it's why I'm here amongst these giants, these massive redwood trees. Is I grew up here. I grew up in the right next to the redwood forest, and this is the environment that I lived in. And when you're growing up in the midst of giants and these giant, massive trees, it's not until you get older and you start exploring more of the world that you understand that this is a very special place. That these trees are not what's found in most forests throughout the earth. And this is where this story kind of kicks in, and why when I look back at the men in my life, I realized that I was around giants. I was raised with giants. So this story, this event that happened to me as a child, it starts with this woman named Sophia. And Sophia was a mother of these two beautiful young girls. And as a young man, I paid a lot of attention to the goings-ons with that family. Uh, but Sophia was coming to our church, and she was this one of those type of women that had this mystique, this presence about her, the thing that made her stand out in a crowd. She was somebody who was very poised and elegant, but demanded your respect in a very gracious way. And she had, like I said, she had these two young, beautiful girls, and she was going to church, and she was just this breath of life. She was just somebody who lived in passion and just spoke eloquently and openly and just with a lot of fervor. But after a year or so, she was coming to the church, and you could see she was run down. And first, she was just looking tired, and then she started to come in with bruises and started to look banged up. And it wasn't until the two church bishops stopped at her house one night. When people came over to have those kind of serious discussions with my dad. Oh, I forgot to mention my dad was the pastor of this church. When people came over to have those serious discussions with my dad, I would get pushed in my room, and they would take over the living room. But the unique thing about that was the room was connected by this heater duct, so I could hear like everything that was going on. And as I was listening in, you could hear them describe what was going on and how they needed to put an end to this and how they needed to stop this. And they started to relay the plan to my dad, and all of a sudden you could hear my dad, and he got very uncomfortable, because they not only wanted to go and talk to the man, they weren't just going to use words in this scenario, but basically the point they were going to get across to him is, whatever happens to Sophia and the kids is going to happen to you. So I just remember my dad, and I just remember, you could hear how uncomfortable he was with this. He's the pastor of this church, and he's the shepherd, and he needs to set, the kind of conduct in which is allowed. But he had this moment, and he said, I don't condone violence, but there are times when I'm not going to stand in the way of it. And it wasn't until that next Sunday that I realized what was going on. Their plan was to go over and talk to Sophia's husband while she was at church that next Sunday, and they weren't going to be missed because they were already scheduled to be at a conference, a religious conference down in the Bay Area. So the story goes, the two bishops did what they were going to do. They went out and confronted Sophia's husband. And right before they got to his house, they stopped at a payphone and called the sheriff and told the sheriff they need to come and arrest him. And as the sheriff was driving up, he was seeing Sophia's husband being thrown out his door and down his steps. The strange thing about this is the sheriff already knew who it was. He already knew what house to go to. And he really did know what those two men were confronting. And he knew that these men weren't there to punish. They were there to protect. The one thing that was really changing in that moment, the one thing that was changing in our society, was our social economics were changing here on the North Coast. All the sawmills that employed the majority of the people, and frankly, the majority of the men, were closing down. The one thing I remember about that time is these jobs were high paying jobs. These men were professionals. They took care of their families. People looked up to them. And all of a sudden, these men were losing their livelihood. And you can imagine, here you are, a 40-year-old man who's, worked very hard and to be a professional, to be good at what you do, to be skillful. And all of a sudden, as these mills were closing, your skills, all that stuff that you've trained for and you've worked at and you've strived to be excellent at, were no longer things people needed. And they started to go back out into the workforce. And as these men started to get back out and apply for jobs, they were just simply told, you're too old. The skills that you have, nobody needs. And frankly, we don't have room for you. And unfortunately, so many of these men in that moment turned to drugs, they turned to alcohol. They were depressed, they were ashamed and embarrassed of their lives. So the sheriff pulled Sophia's husband aside and said, look, I'll arrest these guys right now. Or what you could do in this moment is take this moment to change your life, to be something better. And I think what makes the story so beautiful and this moment so special and what makes these men giants is what they offered him in that moment. And what they offered him in that moment was a job. The two men owned a local tire shop. And they simply said, if you're willing to give up drinking and you make a commitment that you will never harm or hurt Sophia or the kids again, we will help you rebuild and change your life. And what's interesting to me, because at the time I was a kid and I started to realize how fast somebody's life could change and how quickly they could adopt new behaviors. Because literally the next day, this man showed up at that tire shop to start his new career. And the two men that had their arms around him, throwing him, out the door and down the steps, were now, nothing but smiles, throwing their arms around him with the intentions to teach him the ins and outs of the tire business. Because what they knew in that moment, it would be easy to condemn him. It would be easy to go to Sophia and say, you need to leave him. It would be easy to remove that man from his family. And frankly, some people think you probably should. Because they offered him a job and they offered him the ability to go back and become that man that he once was, to make those changes, to be something better. And give him the opportunity and the choice to do that. To me, that is something that makes people giants. A year later, he's the manager of that tire shop, and he became a bishop at the church. The three bishops were called the Three Amigos. And, these three guys, they worked together, they played together, and their families grew up together. So no one knew this story except for me and my dad until he told his story at the funeral of one of those two men. And nobody believed it. This man was just full of kindness and love. He had a beautiful family and a lot of children, a lot of grandchildren. And it was common to hear his children talk about how much their parents adored one another. And nobody believed that this angry man, this man that used violence, even could exist in the same room with this guy. Not even Sophia knew this story until that day. And rumor goes that she put flowers on the graves. And the rumor goes that she put flowers on the gravestones of those two men every week, even long after her husband died. Because she would always tell you, those were the two men who saved my life. Those are the two men that saved my family. Those are the two men that saved my marriage. And those are the two men that saved the man I love the most. This event, this story, has benefited me so much throughout my life. And frankly, it is one of those things, those tools that I use to to understand what masculinity is and what does it really mean to be a man, and the characteristics that I need to adopt to enhance my own masculinity. And the thing that I realized when I think about these men is masculinity is not all about just being tough. It's not just a perception of how strong someone is or how fearless. These men had all these other traits like humility and patience, integrity. People didn't fear their masculinity, they were drawn to it because they served it up with a sense of humor. People wanted to be next to them, people wanted to hear what they had to say. They appreciated what those men did for them. They appreciated the advice those men gave to them. And when I think of these men, and I just think of how amazing they were, and and I constantly hear today this phrase of toxic masculinity. When I see a toxic male, I don't see masculinity. I see someone who is a child, who's selfish, who's ignorant, someone who lacks purpose not only within their mind, but within their body. I see someone who is scared. I see someone who tries to manipulate people, and someone who doesn't have the ability to stand with humility and just say, here's the things I'm good at, and here's the things that I'm bad at. I see somebody who's tired, who's lazy, who blames others for their lack of accomplishments. I see somebody who uses violence and force, not because of their power, but because of the lack of power. And today, we constantly hear academics and people talk about patriarchy. Patriarchy is a system that was put in place to ensure men have power in the future. But the reason I disagree with this, and the reason I have a problem with that term, people don't become powerful because of their tyranny. People become powerful because of their productivity. Real powerful people produce things. They produce good outcomes. They produce a product or a service. We're all seduced by that power. We're seduced by that power because it makes our life better. So when I think about these men in my life, these giants, and I try to reflect on my own masculinity, I think about what am I producing? What am I adding to society? Because real men leave their mark based on what they have achieved. With that said, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you like what we're doing. Also, please hit that notification bell. And again, I hope this was a benefit. I would love to hear what your thoughts are. I would love to hear what you think masculinity is and what does it mean to be a man. Please leave a comment. We read them all and we're excited to see them and we enjoy the discussion. So thanks again for joining us. Have a wonderful day. See you later.